My name is Franklin Pierce. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my career, I've been the kind of man people describe with words like steady, dependable, and low maintenance. I live in Chicago. I work in corporate risk management. At least that's what my title said for a long time. If you met me at a company function, you probably wouldn't remember the details of our conversation. I don't dominate rooms, I don't tell dramatic stories, I don't volunteer bold predictions. I listen more than I speak. I ask questions, I take notes, and that's part of how this happened. In large organizations, visibility often masquerades as value. The loudest voice is mistaken for leadership. The fastest answer is mistaken for intelligence. I was neither loud nor fast. I was careful. I believed in doing the job thoroughly, even if no one clapped for it. For the first 10 years of my career, I advanced predictably. Performance reviews were consistent. Exceeds expectations. High potential. Leadership material. Promotions came on schedule. My managers rotated. The language stayed the same. Then something shifted. Not abruptly, not dramatically, nothing you could point to and say, that was the moment. It was slower than that. Promotions that were in motion stalled. Responsibilities expanded without title changes. Meetings happened without me. Meetings I had once led. I was told to be patient. I was told timing was delicate. I was told the business climate required flexibility. And for a while I believed all of it. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about shouting in conference rooms or exposing corruption in headlines. There are no villains here wearing obvious masks. There are only systems, incentives, and people make quiet decisions that benefit themselves. It's about what happens when you realize your career isn't frozen by accident. It's about reading something most people skim. It's about discovering that a single overlooked clause, buried in a contract I signed years earlier, changed the balance of power in a way no one expected. But more than that, it's about what silence really means. Because when they stalled my promotions, sidelined my role, and quietly hoped I would fade into the background, they mistook my quiet for surrender. They thought invisibility meant I wasn't paying attention. They were wrong. This isn't a story about rage, it's about documentation. It's about patience. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful move you can make isn't confrontation. It's preparation. And when the moment came, there were no raised voices, just paper, just signatures, just consequences that unfolded slowly enough for everyone to realize what they had overlooked. If you've ever been told to wait your turn while watching others skip the line, if you've ever felt your work expand while your title stayed still, if you've ever sensed that you were being managed out without anyone having the courage to say it out loud, then you might understand why this story matters. Have you ever felt yourself slowly disappearing in a place that once promised you growth? To them, I was safe. That's the word I eventually realized described my place in the company hierarchy. Not impressive, not threatening, not visionary. Safe. When I joined Helix Global Logistics 12 years ago, I wasn't trying to climb aggressively. I wasn't networking at every happy hour or volunteering for cross-department visibility projects. I believed the work would speak, that competence consistently demonstrated would carry its own gravity. For a long time, it did. I built internal risk frameworks that reduced audit flags by 30%. I restructured reporting pipelines that saved the compliance team hundreds of hours annually. I was the person executives asked to double-check the exposure before acquisitions, but the praise was always private. The promotions, public, but increasingly for other people. In meetings, I was introduced as, Franklin will handle the details. It was meant as a compliment. The room would nod. Details were important. Details were where mistakes hid. But handling the details gradually became synonymous with staying behind the curtain. When new directors joined, I briefed them. When restructuring happened, I stabilized the transitions. When crises surfaced, I drafted the mitigation memos that others presented. My name was rarely on the slide deck, and I told myself that was fine, because I wasn't ambitious in a loud way. I didn't crave applause. I wanted stability. I wanted progression that matched effort. I wanted the promise, implied when I was hired, that strong performance would translate into advancement. The first time I noticed something shift was during an internal promotion cycle. My manager at the time, Darren, had told me plainly, "You're next in line for director. It's a timing question, not a qualification question." I believed him. I had already begun training a junior analyst to take over portions of my workload, preparing for the transition. I took on strategic planning assignments. I drafted proposals that extended beyond my current scope. Then the announcement came. A new director of risk strategy had been appointed. An external hire. You could feel the air change in the office that morning. Not shock, just that corporate recalibration people perform when expectations quietly collapse. Darren stopped by my desk later that afternoon. "It's temporary," he said. "We needed someone with broader visibility." Broader visibility. It was the first time I heard that phrase applied as a disqualifier. I nodded. I asked thoughtful questions. I did not argue, because arguing would have made it emotional. And I had learned early in my career that emotional men are labeled unstable, especially quiet ones who suddenly aren't. Instead, I adapted. I offered to onboard the new director. I transferred my institutional knowledge. I stayed late to ensure the transition looked seamless. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. My performance reviews that year were glowing. Exceptional reliability, institutional backbone, trusted advisor. But one line caught my attention. "Franklin thrives in support capacity and demonstrates consistent execution strength." Support capacity. It was subtle, almost flattering, but it reframed me. Not as leadership potential, as infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't get promoted, it gets maintained. Over the next 18 months, my responsibilities increased. The new director delegated operational oversight back to me. I handled compliance audits, regulatory negotiations, and vendor risk escalations. He handled executive visibility. I told myself it was temporary, that patience was strategic, that organizations reward endurance. But slowly, I noticed how I was introduced in larger meetings. "This is Franklin. He keeps us out of trouble." Not, "This is Franklin. He leads." It's a small linguistic shift. But language shapes perception, and perception shapes trajectory. To them, I was dependable, non-threatening, the man who would clean up the complexity while others presented the clarity. I wasn't excluded, I was absorbed. And absorption is more dangerous than rejection because it feels like belonging. At the time, I didn't see it as a freeze. I saw it as a phase. But looking back, that was the version of me they preferred. Competent, quiet, grateful, invisible in plain sight. The first small cut didn't feel like a wound. It felt like timing. 3 months after the external director was hired, we had our annual compensation review cycle. I wasn't expecting a dramatic raise. I wasn't naive. But based on my performance metrics and the expanded workload I had absorbed, I expected alignment. Not reward, alignment. Darren scheduled the meeting for late Friday afternoon. That, in hindsight, was the first signal. Important conversations rarely happen at 4:30 p.m. on a Friday unless the goal is emotional containment. He closed the office door gently, sat down across from me, and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. "Strong year," he began. "Really strong. The executive team trusts you." I scanned the numbers. 3%. It was below the company's average adjustment for that cycle. I looked up, not confused, just recalibrating. I said carefully, "Given the additional responsibilities this year, there might be a reclassification discussion." Darren leaned back. "We did discuss it," he said. "The consensus was that while your contribution is significant, your scope hasn't officially changed." Officially, that word stayed with me, because my scope had changed in every functional way. I was leading cross-departmental initiatives. I was signing off on regulatory filings. I was mentoring 2 analysts and indirectly guiding another team, but none of it had been formalized. And formalization is everything. "I see," I replied. There was a pause long enough for him to fill it, but I didn't. Silence is uncomfortable for people who want you to accept something quickly. "Look," he added, lowering his voice slightly. "Between us, the optics matter. If we elevate you now, it complicates some internal alignments." Optics, alignment, scope. The language was careful, vague enough to avoid accountability, specific enough to sound legitimate. I nodded again. On the surface, I handled it professionally. I thanked him for the feedback. I asked what measurable benchmarks would justify reclassification next cycle. He promised we would map that out. Then I returned to my desk. Most people would have vented, texted a friend, updated their resume impulsively. I didn't. Instead, I opened my original employment contract. I'm not sure why. It wasn't dramatic, it was instinctive. When something feels misaligned, I return to documentation. It's a habit I inherited from watching my father trust verbal assurances that vanished the moment they became inconvenient. The contract was standard, at least at first glance. Compensation band, performance review structure, termination clauses. But there was a section I had underlined years earlier during onboarding and never needed to revisit: role evolution and compensation parity clause. It stated that if the employee's responsibilities expanded materially beyond the documented scope for more than 2 consecutive review cycles, without a formal title adjustment, the company would initiate mandatory reclassification review tied to compensation band alignment. Mandatory. At the time I signed it, it felt like boilerplate. Corporate reassurance language. Now, sitting at my desk with a 3% raise that didn't match the reality of my workload, the word read differently. I didn't react. I didn't print it. I didn't forward it to anyone. I simply made a note. Because at that moment, I wasn't building a K. I was testing a hypothesis. Was this an oversight? A temporary misalignment? Or the beginning of a pattern? The first small cut isn't painful because it bleeds. It's painful because it teaches you how much pressure you're expected to absorb without protest. The following week, I noticed something else. An executive summary I had drafted, one that analyzed exposure risks in a pending acquisition, was presented in a board meeting. My language was intact. My structure is unchanged. My name was not on the slide. That wasn't new. But what was new was this. The director referred to the analysis as a strategic reframing of our risk posture. Strategic. The same word that had been withheld from my title conversation. I didn't confront him. I didn't request credit retroactively. I just documented the meeting date, the presentation deck version, the email trail, quietly. At this stage, I wasn't angry. I was attentive, because patterns reveal intention. And intention over time becomes policy. Most people dismiss the first small cut because it doesn't look like an injury. But sometimes the smallest adjustments are calibration points. And I was beginning to understand how I was being calibrated. Not upward, sideways, kept essential, kept stable, kept exactly where I was. The human mind is remarkably adaptable. That's what makes subtle decline so effective. If someone had openly told me, "You're not getting promoted because we don't see you as leadership," I would have responded. Maybe not loudly, but directly. Clarity forces reaction. Instead, I was given ambiguity. And ambiguity is easy to normalize. Over the next year, nothing dramatic happened. That was the strategy. No demotion, no formal reprimand, no negative performance review. In fact, my evaluations became even more complimentary. Franklin is foundational to our operational integrity. Franklin demonstrates exceptional execution under pressure. Franklin is the stabilizer in times of transition. Stabilizer, foundational, execution. If you read those phrases quickly, they sound like leadership language, but leadership wasn't attached to them. The promotions that followed went to people who were described differently. Visionary, dynamic, forward-facing. Those weren't better words. They were directional words. They implied movement. Mine implied maintenance. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, I was repositioned as infrastructure. I began to notice how meetings shifted. I was still invited, but later. Not to shape direction, to validate feasibility. The strategy would be drafted elsewhere. I would be asked, "Franklin, any risk concerns?" Which is another way of saying, "Tell us if this will fail." It's a narrow role. Important, yes, but limiting. I rationalized it. I told myself that expertise deepens before authority expands. That perhaps I needed more executive presence. That my quiet style required patience in a system that rewarded spectacle. I even enrolled in a leadership communication workshop on my own time. Not because anyone suggested I lacked skill, but because I wanted to eliminate every internal doubt. That's the part people don't see. When you're sidelined slowly, you begin auditing yourself. Was I too reserved? Too analytical? Not political enough? Every small oversight was reframed as a self-improvement opportunity. Then came the second promotion cycle after the external hire. By then, I had been performing at a director-level scope for nearly 2 years. I supervised projects across 3 regions. I negotiated directly with regulators in 2 states. My junior analyst had been promoted with my endorsement to a role that technically reported to the director. But operationally, she came to me. This time, I didn't expect promises. I expected the process. The meeting was shorter. We're not opening additional director slots this year, Darren explained. Budget constraints. I didn't argue. I asked one question. Has the scope of my role been evaluated against director criteria? He hesitated. It's comparable in some ways, he admitted. But classification is complex. Translation, it would require acknowledgement. An acknowledgement would require compensation alignment, which would require internal restructuring, which would require someone admitting that I had already been operating beyond my title for years. It was easier to keep me where I was. That's when something subtle happened inside me. Not anger, clarity. Because repetition removes coincidence. 1 delayed promotion is timing. 2 is a trend. 3 is a strategy. The language toward me also began to shift socially. In larger leadership offsites, I was seated slightly farther from the core table. Not intentionally, just logistically. My insights were requested later in discussions, often after decisions had already crystallized. And I complied. I remained composed, professional, solutions-focused. From the outside, I appeared agreeable. Internally, I was observing the normalization of disrespect, not overt disrespect. That would have been easier. The kind that says, we value your work. We just don't value your advancement. There's a psychological comfort in being indispensable. People praise you, depend on you, thank you privately. But indispensability can become a trap. Because if the system truly elevates you, it must replace you. And replacing me would require effort. Keeping me in place required nothing. So I stayed quiet, not because I lacked awareness, but because I was measuring, documenting every expansion of responsibility, saving performance reviews, archiving project scopes, tracking organizational charts before and after restructures. Not to build a complaint, to build context. Disrespect becomes normalized when it's packaged as appreciation. When you're told, we couldn't do this without you, but never, we're ready to put you in charge. And the most dangerous part, you begin to participate in your own containment. You say yes to more work. You absorb more responsibility. You become the solution to problems that prevent you from advancing. I told myself I was being patient, but patience without leverage is just endurance. And endurance has an expiration date. It took me a while to understand that every organization writes stories about its people. Not formally, not in policy manuals, but in patterns. And once a pattern solidifies, you stop being evaluated as an individual. You become a character in a narrative others find convenient. My character was simple. Franklin is steady. Franklin is thorough. Franklin is not political. Franklin prefers the background. That last one was never said directly, but it was assumed. I remember a leadership offsite in Denver. 2 days of strategy sessions, trust-building exercises, and future vision discussions. I had been invited after pushing quietly for broader involvement. On the first morning, the facilitator asked everyone to describe the value they brought to the executive table. One by one, people answered. Vision, growth mindset, revenue acceleration, cultural transformation. When it was my turn, I said risk containment and structural integrity. It was honest. It was accurate. It was also limiting, because structural integrity keeps buildings standing. It doesn't redesign them. Later that afternoon, during a breakout session, the CFO made an offhand comment while we were discussing expansion into a volatile market. Franklin will tell us why it won't work, he said with a half smile. The room laughed lightly. It wasn't malicious, but it was defining. In that moment, I wasn't a strategist. I was the caution sign. Useful, necessary, but not leading. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I replayed the conversation. Not angrily, just analytically. What role had I been playing? The reliable executor, the stabilizer, the man who absorbs complexity and hands back clarity. There's nothing wrong with that role, unless it's the only role you're allowed to play. Over the next few months, I began noticing how often I was handed transitional work. When departments restructured, I was asked to hold things together temporarily. When a new manager struggled, I was asked to mentor quietly. When compliance issues surfaced, I was told, Franklin will fix it. But when new strategic initiatives were announced, international partnerships, product diversification, board-level presentations, I was informed after the direction was already set. I wasn't excluded from execution, I was excluded from authorship. And authorship is where influence lives. One afternoon during a quarterly planning call, I proposed a structural change to how we evaluated vendor exposure. It was preventative, forward-looking, designed to reduce long-term liability. The director nodded politely. Let's table that for now, he said. We need to stay focused on immediate deliverables. 2 weeks later, a nearly identical framework was presented, refined slightly, and credited to a cross-functional task force. I recognized pieces of my language in the proposal. Again, I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I asked myself a harder question. Had I allowed myself to be typecast? Because organizations don't just assign roles. People accept them. I had accepted reliability over visibility, precision over presence, control over authorship, and slowly that acceptance calcified into expectation. I became the person who would not push back, the person who would not demand credit, the person who would carry disproportionate weight quietly. There's a comfort in being underestimated. You're rarely challenged aggressively. You're rarely threatened. You're rarely seen as competition. But there's also a cost. Because when the time comes to advance, decision makers don't ask, is he capable? They ask, is he that kind of person? And I had unintentionally shown them a version of myself that fit neatly into their structure. Not disruptive, not demanding, not ambitious in a way that required them to adjust. The role I was assigned wasn't written anywhere, but it was reinforced everywhere. Franklin is dependable. Franklin is safe. Franklin keeps things stable. And stability in corporate ecosystems is often rewarded with permanence, not progression. I didn't resent them for assigning the role. I began to question why I had accepted it. Because once you see the script others have written for you, you face a choice. Continue performing it or rewrite it. At that point, I was still performing, but something inside me was beginning to shift, quietly. The shift didn't happen in a boardroom. It didn't happen during a confrontation. It happened on a Tuesday evening, long after most of the office lights had gone dark. I was alone at my desk, reviewing a compliance variance report, one that should have been finalized weeks earlier, but had been redirected to me after bandwidth issues in another department. The building was quiet in a way that corporations rarely are during business hours. No footsteps, no low conference room murmurs, just the faint hum of the ventilation system and the soft click of my mechanical pencil against paper. I remember looking up at the glass wall of my office and seeing my reflection layered over the Chicago skyline. For a moment, I didn't recognize the expression on my face. Not frustration, not fatigue, something closer to realization. Earlier that day, I had sat in on a strategy call I wasn't meant to lead but was expected to validate. A new international expansion plan had been approved, aggressive, high exposure, lightly stress tested. At one point, the CEO had said, "We'll have Franklin's sanity check the risk envelope." Sanity check. I wasn't part of the design. I was the insurance policy. And for the first time, I saw the pattern without trying to excuse it. I had become the corporate seatbelt, essential only after acceleration. That night, instead of finishing the variance report, I opened a separate folder on my computer. It contained nothing dramatic. Performance reviews, organization charts, promotion announcements, project scopes with tracked revisions, email chains assigning me expanded authority temporarily. I wasn't angry while reviewing them. I was mapping. 2 full review cycles operating beyond the documented scope. 3, if you counted the informal delegation before the external director's arrival. Repeated language acknowledging my strategic input. Repeated refusal to formalize my classification. And then I reopened my employment contract. Not emotionally, clinically. The role evolution and compensation parity clause was still there. Unchanged, clear. If responsibilities materially exceeded documented scope for more than 2 consecutive review cycles without formal reclassification, the company would initiate mandatory review tied to compensation band alignment. Mandatory. I read it again, slowly. I realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. This wasn't about being overlooked. It was about cost control. Promoting me would trigger salary band adjustments, not just for me, but for those reporting to me. It would reconfigure the departmental hierarchy. It would acknowledge that they had been receiving director-level output at senior analyst pricing. Keeping me stable wasn't oversight. It was efficient, and I had participated in that efficiency. That was the shift. Not anger at them, recognition of my own compliance. I had equated quiet with integrity, but quiet can also be permission. I leaned back in my chair and asked myself a question I hadn't asked before. If I removed emotion from this entirely, if this were purely contractual, what would the data say? The data said my scope had expanded materially. The data said it had persisted beyond 2 review cycles. The data said no mandatory review had been initiated. For years, I had been operating as if fairness would emerge organically. That night, I understood something different. Fairness in corporations isn't self-correcting. It's enforced by structure, and the structure is written. The realization didn't make my heart race. It slowed it. Because once you see leverage clearly, panic disappears. I wasn't powerless. I was patient. And patience, combined with documentation, becomes a strategy. I closed my laptop without finishing the compliance report. For the first time in years, I didn't stay late to fix something immediately. Instead, I went home. Not to vent, not to draft a resignation letter, just to sit with clarity. The next morning, nothing outwardly changed. I attended meetings. I delivered updates. I nodded at the right moments. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. My silence was no longer hopeful. It was intentional. They believed I was stabilizing their expansion. They didn't realize I had begun stabilizing my exit. Not emotionally, legally, quietly. After that Tuesday night, I didn't behave differently. That's important. There was no sudden assertiveness, no visible withdrawal, no change in tone during meetings. If anything, I became even more composed. But internally, the silence changed shape. Before, my silence had been hopeful. It assumed eventual recognition. It was trusted that if I demonstrated enough competence, alignment would follow. Now, my silence was evaluative, intentional, strategic. I stopped offering solutions prematurely. Not maliciously, just deliberately. If a problem surfaced in a meeting, I let others speak first. I listened to how decisions were framed. I noted who was credited for ideas and who was assigned execution. What I discovered was revealing. When I filled the space quickly, leadership relaxed. They leaned on my certainty. My clarity became a safety net. When I withheld immediate answers, even briefly, the room felt less stable. Questions lingered longer. People deferred more carefully. They mistook my quiet for continued compliance. In reality, I was measuring dependency. Dependency is leverage. Over the next quarter, I began documenting with precision. Not emotionally loaded notes, just facts. Dates when my scope expanded. Instances where I signed off on regulatory documents that, by policy, fell under director-level authority. Email chains where I was asked to act on behalf of senior leadership in their absence. Performance reviews, acknowledging strategic oversight without title adjustment. I also pulled archived organizational charts from internal portals. Comparing versions month by month, I tracked how responsibilities had shifted informally without corresponding structural updates. It was meticulous work, but I had always been meticulous. The difference now was intention. At the same time, I made another adjustment. I stopped correcting narratives that minimized my role. If someone introduced me as support, I didn't challenge it publicly. I didn't need to. The record told a different story. One afternoon, during a cross-regional audit call, the VP of Operations casually said, "Franklin's been holding this together for years." There was appreciation in his tone, and blindness in the implication. Holding something together is not the same as being authorized to shape it. But I didn't correct him. I wrote the date down. I also began scheduling brief one-on-one check-ins, not about promotion, but about clarity. With HR, with the director, with Darren, I asked neutral questions. How does the company define material scope expansion? What triggers formal reclassification review? Is there documentation of reclassification evaluations over the past 2 years? The answers were cautious, general, process-oriented, but revealing. Reclassification reviews were typically initiated by department heads, and mine had not been, not once, which meant the clause in my contract hadn't simply been overlooked. It had been avoided That realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm, because avoidance is measurable. I also quietly consulted an employment attorney, not to file anything, not to threaten, just to ask questions. I brought a copy of my contract, annotated with dates and documented scope expansions. The attorney, a woman in her early 50s with a measured, analytical demeanor, read through it slowly. When she looked up, she didn't react dramatically. She simply said, "They've benefited from your silence." It wasn't accusatory. It was observational. "Does the clause have teeth?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "If you can demonstrate sustained material expansion without reclassification, it obligates them to conduct a review. Failure to do so can trigger compensation claims." Trigger, not demand, not negotiate. Trigger. The words settled into place with surprising steadiness. I left her office without scheduling next steps, because silence, at this stage, was still more powerful than action. Back at work, nothing appeared different. I still delivered reports. I still have stabilized projects. I still met deadlines, but internally I had shifted from participant to observer, from hopeful employee to contractual stakeholder. They mistook my composure for continued accommodation. They assumed I was still waiting. In reality, I was aligning. Silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes unsettling in ways loudness never can, because people can prepare for confrontation. They rarely prepare for documentation, and documentation was becoming my language. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed. In the months that followed my quiet consultation with the attorney, I didn't reduce my workload. I didn't disengage. If anything, I became more precise. I stopped working reactively. I started working evidently. With every new responsibility assigned to me, I confirmed it in writing. Just to clarify, I'll be overseeing the regulatory filings for the Northeast Division this quarter, correct? Confirming I'll be acting as escalation point for cross-border vendor risk while the director focuses on expansion initiatives. The responses were casual. "Yes, thanks, Franklin. Appreciate you stepping in. Couldn't do this without you." What they didn't realize was that each confirmation added weight. The clause in my contract didn't rely on perception. It relied on material scope expansion. So I defined material through accumulation. I also began cataloging compensation bands internally. Not salaries, those were confidential, but published ranges tied to titles. Director level roles had specific minimum and midpoint structures. Senior analyst bands were significantly lower. For 3 years, I had been performing work aligned with the higher band, while remaining compensated in the lower one. It wasn't a matter of opinion anymore. It was arithmetic. At the same time, I deepened my understanding of internal policy frameworks, corporate governance guidelines, reclassification protocols, promotion committee review minutes where available. Most employees treat HR documentation like background noise. I treated it like architecture. Architecture reveals load-bearing beams, and I was beginning to see where pressure points lived. One of the most revealing discoveries came accidentally. While reviewing archived intranet updates, I found a policy revision from 2 years earlier, quietly amended language around temporary scope delegation. The revision limited temporary delegation to 6 months without formal review. I had been operating under temporary delegation for over 2 years. That wasn't just misalignment, it was non-compliance. I didn't celebrate the discovery. I didn't even screenshot it immediately. I verified it across archived snapshots. Then I documented the effective date. Meanwhile, externally, I continued playing the role they were comfortable with. The steady one. The one who absorbs complexity. The one who doesn't escalate emotionally. But internally, I stopped absorbing. I tracked. I built the timeline. Year 1. Scope expansion begins informally. Year 2. External director hire, responsibilities retained operationally. Year 3. First reclassification bypassed. Year 4. Second bypass. Continued delegation. Year 5. Policy revision contradicts sustained delegation practice. Patterns became structure. Structure became leverage. There was also something else they never noticed. I stopped volunteering for visibility projects. Not out of resentment, out of clarity. Visibility would have distracted from documentation. If I suddenly pushed aggressively for advancement, it would reframe the narrative as ambition-driven dissatisfaction. Instead, I remained consistent, calm, professional, which made the record cleaner. Around this time, another subtle development occurred. A junior manager, recently promoted, began leaning heavily on me for guidance. In one conversation, she said quietly, "Honestly, Franklin, you're doing director work. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows it." That sentence stayed with me because knowledge without action is complicity, not malicious complicity, convenient complicity. I asked her one question. "Has that been discussed formally?" She hesitated. "Not that I'm aware of." "Of course not. Acknowledgement creates an obligation. An obligation creates cost." By now, my attorney and I had scheduled a second consultation. I presented the timeline, the policy revisions, the documented delegation confirmations. She reviewed everything carefully. "This isn't emotional," she said finally. "It's procedural." That was the confirmation I needed. If this had been about disrespect alone, I might have left. If this had been about ego, I might have negotiated. But this was about written obligations not being honored. And written obligations are enforceable. I asked her what would happen if I initiated formal notice. "They'll likely claim it was an oversight," she said. "They may attempt internal resolution first. But if the documentation supports sustained material expansion without review, you have grounds. Grounds, not a threat. Not retaliation. Grounds. Back at the office, no one sensed change. I still attended planning sessions. I still reviewed contracts. I still stabilized expansion models. But something fundamental had shifted in how I viewed the organization. I no longer saw it as a place waiting to recognize me. I saw it as a system responding to incentives, and systems don't self-correct without pressure. The irony was quiet. For years, I had been protecting the company from risk. Now, I was documenting the risk they had created. Not maliciously, accurately. Preparation is invisible because it doesn't alter behavior immediately. It alters the outcome later. They never noticed the accumulation. They never noticed the shift from hopeful patience to contractual alignment. They never noticed that the same man who kept them structurally secure was mapping their procedural vulnerabilities. And I never gave them a reason to look. The moment of clarity didn't arrive with excitement. It arrived with stillness. By the time I scheduled my third meeting with the attorney, I wasn't seeking validation. I was seeking confirmation that what I already understood would hold under scrutiny. I brought out a printed binder this time. Tab divided. Chronological. Employment contract. Performance reviews. Delegation confirmations. Policy revisions. Organizational charts before and after restructuring. Compensation band ranges. No commentary. Just structure. She reviewed it in silence for nearly 20 minutes. When she finished, she closed the binder carefully and folded her hands. "They built a reliance model around you," she said. I didn't respond immediately. "Explain that," I asked. "They expanded your scope gradually. They formalized very little. They benefited from director-level output without triggering compensation realignment. And they bypassed a mandatory review clause that protects against exactly this scenario." She tapped the contract lightly. "This clause isn't decorative. It was designed to prevent precisely what happened." I felt something settle internally, not adrenaline, not triumph. Weight redistribution. For years, I had felt subtly imbalanced, as if effort and recognition were on uneven scales. Now, I understand something fundamental. The imbalance wasn't accidental. It was structural. "And if we proceed?" I asked. "You issue a formal notice requesting mandatory reclassification review under the clause. If they decline or delay, you escalate to compensation recovery for sustained misclassification. That opens the door to back pay differential." Back pay differential. The phrase was clinical. It translated years of quiet overextension into measurable financial terms. Not emotional damage, not humiliation, quantifiable discrepancy. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the binder. There was no rush of vindication, only clarity, because this wasn't about catching them. It was about recognizing that they had assumed something fundamental about me, that I would never enforce the clause, that I valued stability over equity, that I would continue absorbing expansion indefinitely. "What's their likely response?" I asked. "They'll try to contain it internally," she said. They may offer promotion now to avoid acknowledgement of past oversight. They may propose partial compensation adjustments without admitting sustained misclassification. And if I decline internal settlement, then it becomes procedural, discovery, documentation, and negotiation. Discovery. That word shifted the energy slightly. Discovery means exposure, not scandal, not headlines, but internal exposure, executive emails, delegation decisions, compensation deliberations. The architecture I had mapped would become visible. I left her office without signing anything, not because I was uncertain, because timing matters. Back at Helix, nothing outward had changed. But internally, I had crossed a line. I no longer wondered whether I had leverage. I knew I did. And knowledge changes posture. Not externally, internally. During a quarterly executive review that week, I presented risk projections with my usual composure. Halfway through, the CFO interrupted. As always, Franklin keeps us grounded. The room nodded. Grounded. For the first time, I understood the full weight of that word. Grounded means tethered, anchored, preventing flight. They had built their expansion strategies assuming my structural containment. They had relied on my stability while limiting my advancement. And now I held documentation that demonstrated procedural non-compliance at scale. It wasn't explosive. It was precise. After the meeting, the director stopped by my office. "Appreciate you stepping up again," he said. "You're indispensable." Indispensable. I met his eyes calmly. "No one's indispensable," I replied evenly. "Systems just adjust slowly." He laughed lightly, assuming it was a philosophical comment. It wasn't. That night, at home, I reviewed the binder one final time. Not to add, not to refine, just to confirm alignment. I asked myself a final internal question. Was this about ego? No. If they had promoted me a year earlier without backtracking on past scope, I might have accepted it. Was this about money? Partially, but not primarily. It was about enforcement, about whether written protections mean anything if never invoked, about whether silence is patience or surrender. The private reveal wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no secret meetings in parking garages, just a quiet understanding that the dynamic had shifted permanently. For years, they believed I was protecting them from risk. They never realized they had become one. And now the decision was no longer whether I had leverage. It was whether I would use it. Leverage is neutral. It doesn't demand to be used. It simply waits. For weeks after the private reveal, I did nothing. That was intentional, because once you move, you can't return to stillness. And I needed to be certain that I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. There were realistically 3 options in front of me. The first was the quiet exit. Update my resume. Take a director role elsewhere. Leave Helix with a polished farewell email and preserved relationships. Many people would have done exactly that. Clean break, no friction, but a quiet exit would validate the strategy they had used. Delay advancement, extract value. Let the employee self-select out. No accountability, no structural correction. The second option was internal escalation without legal framing. Schedule a meeting with HR. Present the documentation. Request immediate reclassification and retroactive compensation informally. This option had appeal. It preserved discretion. It gave them a chance to correct course without external pressure. But it also relied on voluntary compliance. And voluntary compliance was what the clause existed to enforce. The third option was a formal notice. Trigger the clause. Activate the mechanism that had been quietly bypassed. Irreversible in tone. Procedural in nature. Once filed, it would require documentation review, legal consultation on their side, internal acknowledgement that the system had failed to initiate mandatory review. I sat with these options for days. I walked along the lake after work, letting the wind off Lake Michigan clear my thoughts. I wasn't angry. I wasn't desperate. I was calibrating. What did I actually want? Not revenge, not humiliation, alignment. But alignment after sustained imbalance requires more than conversation. It requires structure. One evening, I opened my father's old file cabinet in the corner of my study. After he lost his job decades ago, he kept every document related to his termination. Performance reviews, letters, emails. There was no clause protecting him. Just verbal assurances that never materialized into written commitments. He trusted the system to self-correct. It didn't. I closed the drawer gently. That was the difference. My contract contained language designed to prevent quiet exploitation. And if I chose not to enforce it, the clause would remain symbolic. The next morning, I scheduled one final consultation with my attorney. "I need to know," I told her, "if we proceed formally, is there risk of retaliation?" "There's always relational friction," she replied. "But retaliation following formal contractual notice would compound their exposure. They know that." Exposure. Another word that once belonged exclusively to my job description, now it applies in reverse. If I initiate, I asked, is there a path back? Not to the same dynamic, she said calmly. Even if you stay, the relationship changes. That was the real decision point. Not legal risk, relational shift. I had spent 12 years being the stabilizer, the quiet constant. Was I prepared to disrupt that identity? On a Thursday afternoon, I received another delegation email. Franklin, can you take point on the Southeast Compliance Review? We're stretched thin. There it was again. Expansion without acknowledgement. I replied as I always did. Happy to support. Please confirm whether this extends my oversight scope into the Southeast Regulatory Authority for Q3. The confirmation came within minutes. Correct. Appreciate it. I stared at the screen for a moment. 2 consecutive review cycles. Material expansion. Policy limiting temporary delegation to 6 months. Mandatory review clause. The architecture was complete. I drafted the formal notice that evening. It was 3 pages long. Precise. Reference contract language. Outlined, documented, scope expansions with dates. Cited policy revisions. Requested initiation of mandatory reclassification review and compensation alignment under the clause. No accusations. No emotional language. Just structure. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop without sending it. Because once sent, the waiting begins. And waiting after action feels different than waiting before it. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. The skyline was still muted in dawn light. I sat at my desk, opened the email draft, and attached the supporting documentation index. Not the full binder yet, just the index. Then I addressed it to Director, HR Business Partner, General Counsel. I paused for exactly one breath, not out of fear, out of acknowledgement. 12 years of quiet compliance ending with one deliberate click. Then I pressed send. There was no sound, no immediate response, just a subtle shift in gravity. The decision had been made. The first thing I noticed after sending the email was nothing. No instant reply, no emergency meeting request, no subtle glances across the office floor. Silence. But this silence felt different from the kind I had lived in for years. Before, silence had been passive. Now, it was active, procedural, measured. Within 4 hours, I received a brief response from HR. Franklin, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We are reviewing your request and will revert shortly. Neutral, professional, controlled. That same afternoon, my director stopped by my office. His expression was composed, but tighter than usual. Can we talk? He asked. We sat across from each other. No raised voices, no visible tension. I was surprised by your email, he said. I understand, I replied, evenly. You could have come to me first. I met his eyes calmly. I've raised scope alignment concerns in prior review cycles. This is a formal contractual mechanism. He nodded slowly, absorbing the phrasing. Contractual mechanism. No complaint. Not an accusation. Mechanism. I think we can resolve this internally, he said. No need to escalate. It's not escalation, I said. It's activation. That was the first moment I saw uncertainty flicker. Because activation implies obligation. We spoke for 20 minutes. He asked questions about specific dates. I referenced documentation without defensiveness. I didn't accuse him of intentional avoidance. I simply stated that the clause required review once certain conditions were met, and those conditions had been sustained. By the end of the conversation, his tone had shifted. HR and legal will likely want a formal review meeting, he said. That's appropriate, I replied. And that was it. No confrontation, no heat, just an acknowledgement that something had changed. Over the next week, the atmosphere around me subtly recalibrated. Meetings became slightly more formal when I entered. Language tightened. Delegation emails became more cautious. Instead of Franklin will handle, I began seeing, let's discuss scope alignment before assigning. It was subtle, but measurable. Meanwhile, legal requested the full documentation binder. I provided it within the hour, not emotionally. Efficiently, my attorney had advised me not to engage in hallway negotiations. All communication would be documented. Meetings would include HR. So when an informal coffee invitation came from Darren, let's just clear the air, I declined politely. I prefer we keep discussions within the formal review structure, I wrote. There's something disarming about refusing to argue. They couldn't paint me as volatile. They couldn't frame this as dissatisfaction. Everything I did remained consistent with my historical behavior. Calm, precise, structured. The difference was that now the structure protected me. 2 weeks later, a formal review meeting was scheduled. Participants: HR business partner, director, general counsel representative, myself. The tone was procedural. They acknowledged receipt of my documentation. They confirmed that sustained scope expansion had occurred. They emphasized that no intentional misclassification had been intended. I didn't respond to intent. I responded to the process. The clause specifies mandatory review after 2 consecutive cycles, I said. The expansion has persisted for 3. Legal nodded slightly. There was a brief exchange of numbers: compensation band ranges, differential calculations, timeline assessments. It felt less like a confrontation and more like an audit, which ironically was my specialty. They requested 2 additional weeks to evaluate remediation pathways. I agreed. Outside the room, nothing dramatic unfolded. But internally, departments began adjusting. Certain responsibilities were temporarily reassigned, perhaps to minimize ongoing exposure. An interim director oversight memo was circulated, clarifying reporting lines. It was subtle containment, and I watched it with analytical calm. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't anxious. I was observing structural correction in motion. The most revealing shift happened during a quarterly executive call. When the expansion strategy was discussed, the CFO paused and said, "Let's ensure scope accountability is clearly defined." Scope accountability. Language evolves quickly when risk becomes visible. No one mentioned my name. They didn't need to. The system had felt pressure, and systems respond to pressure. The key was that I never raised my voice. I never threatened. I never posted on social media. I simply activated a clause they assumed would remain dormant. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about discipline. Every email is measured. Every meeting is documented. Every response is calm. Because once you choose irreversible action, composure becomes leverage. And the consequences had only just begun to unfold. Consequences rarely arrive as explosions. They arrive as adjustments. Small at first, almost administrative. 2 weeks after the formal review meeting, I began noticing subtle recalibrations across the department. Projects that had historically defaulted to me were being reassigned, carefully, almost cautiously, not in a way that diminished my authority, in a way that limited further exposure. Temporary oversight roles were formalized with written timelines. Delegation language tightened. Phrases like "Franklin will handle indefinitely" disappeared. In their place, pending structural clarification. Structural clarification. That's what pressure does. It forces precision. HR scheduled a second review session. This time there was less discussion about whether scope expansion had occurred and more about how long it had persisted. 3 full fiscal cycles. That number carried weight. Legal presented a spreadsheet outlining compensation band differentials over that period. The figures weren't theatrical. They were clinical. Director minimum band midpoint versus senior analyst midpoint. Annual differential multiplied across 3 years. Performance-based bonus impact recalculated within proper band alignment. When the number was spoken aloud, no one reacted dramatically. But the air in the room shifted because it was no longer abstract. It was quantifiable. "We are prepared to offer immediate reclassification to director," HR said carefully. "Effective retroactively to the start of the last fiscal year." Retroactively to the last fiscal year. Not the first. Not the second. Just the most recent. I didn't respond immediately. I had anticipated this. Partial acknowledgement. Limited liability. "We appreciate the offer," I said evenly. However, the documented material expansion began prior to that period. The clause triggers mandatory review once sustained over 2 cycles. Legal interjected gently. "We are reviewing the interpretation of sustained materiality." That was expected. Interpretation is where corporations negotiate, but interpretation becomes fragile when documentation is chronological and consistent. Over the following week, something more interesting began happening internally. I wasn't excluded, but I was no longer invisible. In executive meetings, my input was solicited earlier. My title, still unchanged at that moment, was referenced with more care. One afternoon, the CFO stopped by unexpectedly. "Franklin," he said, measured but direct. "This situation caught some of us off guard." "I understand," I replied. "You've always been steady," he continued. "We didn't realize you felt misaligned." That sentence revealed more than he intended. It wasn't about feeling. It was about documentation. "I didn't frame it emotionally," I said. "I framed it contractually." He nodded slowly. "That's clear now." There was no hostility in his tone, only recalibration. Meanwhile, rumors began circulating, not about a lawsuit, not about conflict, but about internal classification review. People sensed structural tension without understanding its origin. A junior analyst asked me quietly, "Is something changing?" "Processes are being reviewed," I replied calmly. That was true. Consequences don't always punish. Sometimes they illuminate, and illumination makes people uncomfortable. Departments began auditing their own delegation patterns. HR issued a company-wide reminder about role classification policies and temporary scope limits. No names were mentioned, but the timing wasn't coincidental. The most significant shift happened behind closed doors. My attorney informed me that legal had requested a mediation discussion rather than a prolonged internal dispute. Mediation meant acknowledgement of exposure risk, not public risk, procedural risk. They weren't afraid of scandal. They were calculating precedent. If my clause were enforced fully, others might examine their own contracts more closely. And that's when I understood something deeper. This wasn't just about my compensation. It was about system correction. For years, I had protected the company from external regulatory risk. Now, my action has exposed internal compliance risk. The irony wasn't lost on me. At home one evening, I reviewed the updated offer they had sent formally. Immediate director title. Compensation aligned to the director band midpoint. Partial retroactive pay covering 18 months. Retention bonus contingent on continued employment. It was generous by most standards, but incomplete. Not emotionally, procedurally, because the clause didn't mention partial remediation. It referenced sustained expansion, and sustained expansion was documented beyond 18 months. The consequences were unfolding not in anger, but in arithmetic, not in shouting, but in spreadsheets. And the most revealing part, no one blamed me openly. They couldn't. Everything I had done was within the contract they drafted, within the policies they published, within the structure they relied on me to uphold for others. The system was adjusting, but it hadn't finished adjusting yet. By the time mediation was formally scheduled, the tone inside the company had shifted from confidence to containment, not panic. Panic is loud. This was quieter, calculated. HR began using phrases like holistic resolution and forward-looking alignment. Legal avoided the word liability entirely. Instead, they spoke about risk mitigation through collaborative restructuring. It was careful language, but beneath it, there was urgency. The mediation session took place in a neutral conference suite downtown, not at the Helix office. Present were my attorney, external counsel representing the company, and a senior HR executive who had never previously been involved in my review cycles. That alone was revealing. When a new authority enters a room, it means internal control has shifted. The company's position was refined. They acknowledged extended scope expansion beyond original classification parameters. They emphasized organizational complexity during growth phases. They proposed a comprehensive package, immediate director reclassification, full retroactive compensation covering 2 fiscal years, adjustment to bonus calculations for that period, a structured path towards senior director within 12 months, confidentiality clause. On paper, it was significant. It corrected most of the financial differential. It elevated my title. It even offered future advancement. Years earlier, I would have accepted without hesitation, but mediation changes perspective, because by then I understood something fundamental. This wasn't an oversight corrected by goodwill. It was a structural failure corrected under pressure. And once pressure is required, trust shifts permanently. During a break in the session, my attorney leaned toward me. "They're trying to prevent precedent," she said quietly. "If this escalates further, internal audits widen." Widen. That word carried weight because the issue wasn't unique to me. Rapidly growing corporations often stretch roles without formal reclassification. It's efficient in the short term until someone enforces the clause. Back inside the room, the company's counsel asked a direct question. "What outcome are you seeking, Mr. Pierce?" There it was. Not what they were offering. What I was seeking. I answered carefully. "Enforcement," I said, "not accommodation." The room went still. "Enforcement of the clause as written," I clarified. Material expansion began earlier than 2 fiscal years ago. Documentation reflects 3 sustained cycles. Silence. They knew the numbers, but enforcement meant acknowledging the full timeline, which meant a larger payout, which meant greater internal scrutiny. After several hours of negotiation, a revised offer emerged. Full retroactive compensation covering 3 fiscal cycles. Director reclassification is effective retroactively to the first documented expansion period. Public internal acknowledgement of role elevation framed as long-standing strategic leadership. No admission of fault. Mutual separation option with enhanced severance if desired. The mutual separation clause changed everything. It meant they understood something I had already accepted. Even if I stayed, the relationship would not return to its previous equilibrium. Once you enforce structure, you are no longer infrastructure. You are precedent, and precedent makes organizations cautious. When mediation concluded for the day, no final signature had been placed. They requested 48 hours to confirm internal approvals. Back at the office, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Senior executives moved with tighter coordination. Conversations hushed when I entered, not in hostility, but in awareness. The director avoided casual hallway exchanges. Delegations had slowed dramatically. It wasn't anger I sensed. It was a recalibration mixed with something else. Regret. Because they realized too late that keeping me stable had been cheaper than replacing me, but more expensive than promoting me properly. That's the paradox of cost control. It works until it doesn't. One afternoon, Darren approached me quietly. "I wish you'd pushed harder earlier," he said. I looked at him calmly. "I did," I replied. "In performance reviews, in scope discussions, this is just the first time the contract was referenced." He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue. Too late to fix it doesn't mean destruction. It means the window for quiet correction has closed. Now, correction requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement carries weight. 2 days later, the finalized agreement arrived. Numbers aligned, timeline corrected, reclassification formalized retroactively, optional separation clause activated at my discretion. I read it slowly, not with triumph, with clarity, because this was no longer about proving a point. It was about deciding who I wanted to be next, and that decision would define everything that followed. The final meeting wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no closing arguments were delivered with intensity. Just a long conference table, 4 chairs. A document was placed neatly in front of each of us. Present were the director, the CFO, the senior HR executive, and I. Legal had already finalized the language. Mediation had narrowed the variables. What remained wasn't negotiation. It was an acknowledgement. The HR executive began. "Franklin, we appreciate the professionalism you've maintained throughout this process." I nodded. Professionalism had never been the issue. She continued, "We've reviewed the documentation thoroughly. We recognize that your role evolved materially beyond your formal classification over a sustained period. Recognize, do not admit fault. Recognize." It was carefully phrased and sufficient. The CFO leaned forward slightly. "You've been integral to this company's structural stability," he said. "That hasn't gone unnoticed." I met his eyes calmly. "I understand," I replied. This was never about visibility, it was about alignment. There was a pause, because alignment implies imbalance exists. The director spoke next. "I should have initiated reclassification earlier," he said. His tone wasn't defensive, it was measured. I prioritized operational continuity over structural adjustment. That was the closest anyone had come to saying the truth plainly. Operational continuity. Translation, it was easier to keep you where you were. I didn't challenge him. I didn't need to. Continuity and compliance aren't mutually exclusive, I said evenly. The clause was designed to protect both. Silence followed. Not hostile, just reflective. The HR executive slid the final agreement across the table. Retroactive director classification is effective 3 fiscal cycles prior. Full compensation differential dispersed in a structured payment. Bonus recalibration, formal internal announcement of title correction, mutual separation option with enhanced severance available within 90 days. Everything aligned. The system had corrected itself under pressure. The CFO asked the final question. "Do you intend to remain with Helix?" There it was. Not legal, personal. For 12 years, I had been the stabilizer, the quiet center, the dependable constant. But something fundamental had shifted the day I pressed send. Trust doesn't dissolve in anger. It dissolves in calculation. "I haven't decided," I answered truthfully. "I'm evaluating what alignment means going forward." No one pressed further. because they understood once a contractual clause is enforced, the dynamic changes permanently. I signed the agreement calmly. No dramatic pen stroke, no visible emotion. Just signed the meeting paper. The director extended his hand. "I hope we can move forward constructively," he said. I shook it. "So do I." And I meant it. There was no desire for humiliation, no need for victory. The objective had never been to wound the company. It had been to restore balance. As I left the conference room, I noticed something subtle. Conversations no longer paused when I passed. They adjusted. Respect feels different from reliance. It's steadier, less transactional. The internal announcement went out 2 days later. Franklin Pierce appointed Director of Risk Strategy, recognizing long-standing leadership contributions. Carefully framed, no reference to clause enforcement, no acknowledgement of dispute. But those who understood the structure knew what had happened, and those who didn't simply saw correction. Confrontation without heat doesn't scorch relationships. It clarifies them. They had learned something about me, and I had learned something about them. The only question left was whether clarity was enough to rebuild trust. For a few weeks after the announcement, I continued walking into the same building, same glass facade, same elevator hum, same skyline view from the conference room, but I wasn't the same person moving through it. Externally, the correction had been made. My title now matched my scope. My compensation reflected the band I had been operating within for years. Colleagues adjusted quickly. Corporate ecosystems are efficient at normalizing change. Congratulations, Franklin. Well deserved. Long overdue. Long overdue. That phrase carried more honesty than most realized. But internally, I understood something deeper. The enforcement had changed my identity. Not just within the company, but within myself. For 12 years, I had defined myself by endurance, by patience, by stability. There's dignity in those qualities. But there's also risk in mistaking tolerance for strength. Strength isn't absorbing the imbalance indefinitely. Strength is recognizing when structure must be activated. In the weeks that followed, I paid attention to how I felt during executive meetings. Before I had entered as infrastructure, necessary but background. Now, when I spoke, the room listened differently. Not because my insights changed, but because my position had been formalized. Authority shapes acoustics, but something else had shifted too. I no longer felt compelled to prove my steadiness. I didn't volunteer for excessive containment roles. When delegation crossed structural boundaries, I redirected it clearly. That falls under director oversight. Let's formalize the reporting structure first. No tension, just clarity. And surprisingly, resistance was minimal, because once a system adjusts under pressure, it tends to avoid repeating the same vulnerability. At home, I reflected often on the mutual separation clause. 90 days to decide whether to remain or step away with enhanced severance. Earlier in my career, that decision would have terrified me. Now, it felt like optionality. Enforcement had restored balance, but it had also revealed something irreversible. The company had not corrected itself voluntarily. It was corrected under exposure. That distinction matters. Trust, once recalibrated, doesn't return to innocence. It becomes transactional, and transactional relationships can function well if both parties acknowledge them honestly. One evening, I reopened my father's old file cabinet, this time not out of caution, out of perspective. He had lost everything because nothing was written. I had protected myself because something was written, and I chose to enforce it. That difference defined who I had become. Not louder, not aggressive, just unwilling to confuse silence with surrender. I realized something else too. The story wasn't about suing the corporation. It was about invoking a clause they assumed would remain dormant, about transforming quiet competence into quiet leverage, about understanding that fairness inside systems is rarely granted. It's triggered. Who I am now isn't defined by the settlement. It's defined by the boundary. I still value stability. I still prefer calm rooms to dramatic ones. I still believe in documentation over confrontation, but I no longer accept invisibility as the cost of professionalism. Whether I remain at Helix or not, the identity shift is permanent. I am not infrastructure. I am not a background. I am not the stabilizer by default. I am a participant in structure, and structure, when written, can be enforced. The decision about staying would come soon, but regardless of where I worked next, I carried something forward that no title could grant. Clarity without bitterness, power without noise, and the quiet understanding that contracts matter, especially when no one expects you to read them twice. In the end, I did leave. Not immediately, not impulsively. I stayed long enough to ensure the structural corrections weren't symbolic, long enough to transition projects responsibly, long enough to confirm that what had been enforced would not quietly unravel once attention shifted. Then I activated the mutual separation clause, not out of resentment, out of alignment. Because once you see a system clearly, you can choose whether you want to operate inside it or build differently elsewhere. They didn't fight the departure. The severance terms were honored precisely as written. The tone of my exit was professional, measured, almost understated. No bridges burned, no speeches delivered, just signatures and closure. People sometimes assume this story is about revenge. It isn't. Revenge is emotional, reactive, loud. This was procedural, calm, intentional. The overlooked clause in my employment contract didn't magically transform my life. It didn't humiliate executives or collapse the corporation. It did something quieter. It corrected a structural imbalance. It forced acknowledgement where convenience had replaced compliance. It proved that silence can be strength if it's paired with documentation. The truth is, many organizations don't freeze careers out of cruelty. They do it out of efficiency. It's easier to expand someone's responsibilities than to reclassify their compensation. Easier to rely on the dependable than to elevate them. Until the dependable person reads the fine print. I didn't sue out of anger. I sued because the clause required activation once conditions were met. There's a difference, and that difference matters. What I learned is simple. If it isn't written, it isn't real. And if it is written, it can be enforced. The most powerful move I made wasn't pressing send on the formal notice. It was years earlier, keeping copies, saving emails, tracking scope, reading carefully. Preparation doesn't feel dramatic. It feels ordinary. But ordinary habits compound. Today, I work differently. I still value stability. I still operate calmly. But I formalize the scope immediately. I document expansion in real time. I treat contracts as living structures, not onboarding paperwork. And I teach younger professionals the same thing. Not how to fight, how to read, how to measure, how to understand that quiet people are often watching more closely than anyone realizes. If you're listening to this and you feel stalled, sidelined, slowly absorbed into a role that keeps expanding without acknowledgement, before you react emotionally, pause, review what's written, track what's measurable, understand the structure you're operating inside. Because sometimes the power you think you've lost is sitting quietly in a clause you skimmed years ago. I'm not proud of suing, but I'm proud of enforcing fairness without noise. So let me ask you something. If you discovered your career wasn't frozen by accident, but by convenience, would you walk away quietly? Or would you read the fine print one more time?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.